stuff. And here we go. Let's get started with today's episode. We have my co-host Jen Abbott joining us and our very special guest, Michael Hingson. This is one story you do not want to miss. Michael has been blind since birth. He grew up with sighted parents, believing raising Michael with a can-do attitude and the same opportunities as his siblings. He went to university, graduating with a degree in physics and teaching. Michael has achieved so much in his life and spent nearly 30 years working for high-tech companies in time management roles. Michael's life changed dramatically on September the 11th, 2001, when he and his guide dog, Roselle, escaped from the 78th floor of Tower 1 in the World Trade Center, moments before it collapsed. Soon after, Michael and Roselle were thrust into the international limelight, where Michael began to share his unique survival story and 9/11 lessons of trust, courage, heroism, and teamwork. We are so lucky to have Michael with us today. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And where are you joining us from, Michael?
I live in Southern California in a town called Victorville. We're a little ways away from Brisbane, but
Yeah, just a tad. And we
just a little
thank
bit. It's
you
a little bit
for
far to walk.
we thank you for joining us with such a time difference. So we really do appreciate it.
Oh,
Your
not a problem at all.
your story is so inspiring. Can you share a bit about your journey and how you've built the life that you have today?
Sure. I was born 2 months premature and put in an incubator, and although medical science hadn't really accepted it, it had been started to be learned that providing a pure oxygen environment to a premature baby in an incubator could cause retinas not to develop properly, and the result is that children could go blind. And I happened to be one of the ones that experienced that. So essentially, I've been blind my whole life. Um, and after about 4 months of being about 4 months of age, the well, we discovered that I was blind, and the way we did it was that my aunt, who lived near us, we were all in Chicago, Illinois at the time. That's where we lived. My aunt said, to my mother, your son's not reacting at all to sunlight. Mikey's not showing any indication that any of that bothers him. I think he's blind. Well, they took me to the hospital, and it turned out that I was. And the doctors immediately said, you should send him to a home because no blind child can contribute to society. He's just going to be a drain. He's not going to do anything that will be helpful or productive. And he's just going to take up all the love that you have, even for your older son. And my parents basically said, no, you're wrong. He can do whatever he chooses, and we're going to give him that opportunity. That was unusual.
Oh, I love
And
your
it's
words already.
and and it's still
Yeah.
unusual to a very large degree, not only with blindness, but other disabilities. But specifically, I'm going to deal with blindness. It still is something that people believe. Well, anyway, I grew up believing that I could do what I wanted to do, and my parents gave me that opportunity. Um, in Chicago, my father owned a television repair shop. Back in those days, you didn't replace TVs when they died, you repaired them. So he
Yeah.
was one of the people who did that. He and my uncle owned the shop, and they did that. And sometimes I went with my father um, and all that. But anyway, at 5 years of age, after going through a year of kindergarten in a special class for blind kids, because my parents advocated with the school district and other parents of blind children who were prematures that there should be a kindergarten class, and there was. And I actually started to learn Braille in kindergarten and other things like that. But then after kindergarten, we moved to California, and the school district out there said, well, in California, you start kindergarten when you're 5. So I had to have a second year of kindergarten. Gosh, how many kids have to go through 2 years of kindergarten? But anyway, I did. The only problem is that I had no teachers nor anyone who knew anything about blindness. I didn't have any access to Braille or any of that. So for my first 3 years of school, well, 4 years, including that year of kindergarten, I didn't have access to Braille books, and my mother would read material to me and tell me whatever it is that I needed to know. And my father taught me how to do math and even do math in my head because I didn't have any other way to do it. So I learned to do algebra in my head by the time I was 6. And so I went ahead and progressed and did okay. But then when I went into fourth grade, it turns out there was a teacher who was hired because there were a number now of blind kids. And so Mrs. Hirschberger was hired as a what was called resource teacher who would be able to help in terms of us getting Braille books and helping me with other things that I needed to learn to be able to function. And so I became more integrated, if you will, into regular classes. And so from the fourth grade on, I had Braille. I read out loud in class like other people and things like that. So it all worked out. Um, I was interested in science and built some little radios growing up. I joined the Cub Scouts, then the Boy Scouts, eventually became an Eagle Scout in the Boy Scouts with an additional 2 Palms, which was another 10 plus merit badges. I also joined an organization called the Order of the Arrow, which is the honor society in the Boy Scouts, and became Vigil, which is the top honor, top rank in Order of the Arrow. Um, and continue to be interested in science. I got my first guide dog when I went into high school at the age of 14. And my mother, between time I got my dog and the time we started school, would take me over to the high school campus and we learned the campus. So I knew how to get around and go to various rooms and so on. And then um, went through high school, then went to college at the University of California at Irvine. And as you said, got a degree. I got a bachelor's and a master's degree in physics and a secondary teaching credential. My father and I got amateur radio or ham radio licenses when I was 14. And in fact, I have to renew my license. It's been a long time since I got my license, because that goes back to 1964. And so here it is, 60 years. Anyway, so um, I went on to college. And while in college, I also worked at the campus radio station. I was program director for a year and did other things and participated where I could in activities. And along the way, I also joined an organization called the National Federation of the Blind, which is an organization of blind consumers in the United States. It's the largest consumer organization in the world with over 50,000 members. And um, one of the things that happened in the 1974 to 1975 year was that a guy named Ray Kurzweil, I'm sure you've probably heard of him, he invented the reading machine and did other kinds of things. He's a futurist and an inventor. He had developed a way for computers to be able to read any print styles on a page called omnifont optical character recognition. Until Ray did it, no one else had been able to make it happen. Most people didn't believe that he was able to do it, and so they wouldn't help him fund the machine. The Federation, after seeing that his machine really did read whatever they wanted to throw at it, they helped him secure some funding. And the idea behind the funding was to put several machines around the country for blind people to use. And out of that would come recommendations that would go into the final production model of the machine. Well, they had to hire somebody to do all of that work, to coordinate the project on a day-to-day basis, to travel where the machines were and so on. And so I had just graduated and I was hired literally to live in hotels out of suitcases for 18 months, traveling around the country, uh, setting up machines, teaching people to use the machines, writing curricula for the machines, sometimes fixing a broken machine, and eventually writing the final report that would contain all the recommendations that would go into the production model of the machine. And so um, then after that project was over in 1978, I went to work for Ray doing the same work, but only was able to do it for about 8 months. And then I was called into the office of the vice president of marketing who said, "We're laying you off." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Oh, understand, it's not that you're doing a bad job. You're doing a great job. We like what you're doing. But the problem is that what you're doing doesn't produce revenue for us. And like a lot of small engineering startup companies, we've hired way too many non-revenue producing people. So we have to lay off some people and hire salespeople. So we're going to have to lay you off." And then he paused and he said, "Unless you're willing to go into sales. But we don't want you to sell the reading machine. We have a new version for commercial effort that lawyers and bankers and book publishers and anyone else who has print that needs to scan it and put it into a computer can use. In that machine, unlike the reading machine that costs $50,000, that machine costs $125,000, and that's what we want you to sell. And I realized that that was a compliment to even ask me about that because I hadn't sold. And I made that observation to him. And he said, no problem. We'll send you to a Dale Carnegie sales course. You'll learn all about selling. So, as I love to tell people, I took a nano microsecond and then decided I would lower my standards and go from science to sales and start to sell. And so by mid 1979, I was in the sales role at Kurzweil and did that until June of 1984 when Xerox bought the company and phased out all of the salespeople in the commercial end of the product sales effort. And then I started looking for a job. Well, back then, the unemployment rate among employable blind people was in the 70 to 80% range. And no matter what I tried, no matter what people thought of my resume, once they met me and discovered I was blind, I was not given any opportunities. So eventually I started my own company selling computer-aided design or CAD systems to architects, the most graphically intense device around. And I was selling pretty new and revolutionary PC-based CAD systems. And we hired some people to help sell it. But I also could sit an architect, for example, down in front of the machine. I didn't need to work the machine, but I did know how to work it. I did need to know how to work it so I could describe that to other people. Well, the bottom line is that's what happened. And I did that for 4 years and we did okay. We weren't overly successful. A lot of things happened along the way, but eventually I sold the company and went back into the workforce and worked for a company from mid 1989 until 1997. And then I was recruited. But by that time, I had been asked to move to New York because I was selling to New York, and Wall Street likes to have manufacturers actually have a presence in the city. So I moved back there for my company. I was married by that time also. My wife and I met in January of 1982. We got married in November of 1982. And just to jump forward for a second, um, we were married 40 years. She passed away in November of 2022. So I've got 40 years of memories and all that, but we'll get that. We'll get back there. By the way, she also was a person with a disability. She used a wheelchair her whole life. Anyway, we moved to New Jersey and I was recruited away. And then in 1999, recruited away again by a company that asked me to open an office for them. And we opened the office on the 78th floor of Tower 1 of the World Trade Center in August of 2000. And there I was in my office preparing to teach some of our reseller partners how to sell our products on September 11th, 2001, when we were attacked. When the building was attacked 18 floors above us on the other side of the building. People always used to say after September 11th, well, did you know what was going on? And I said no. And they said, well, of course, because you couldn't see it. Excuse me. The last time I checked, Superman and X-ray vision are fiction. And the reality is
Mhm.
from the 78th floor on the south side to see up to about the 96th floor on the north side is not something anyone can do. The reality is we have 18 floors of rebar, steel, and concrete. I didn't know, and nobody did. And as we were going down the stairs, nobody knew what was going on. But the bottom line is that the building was attacked. But I had spent a lot of time learning what to do in the case of an emergency. I learned everything I could about traveling around the World Trade Center, where offices were, what all the emergency evacuation procedures were, how the building functioned. I talked to fire people, Port Authority security people, police, and so on, learned everything that I could. And the bottom line is that through all that, um, I knew what to do. And it kind of created a mindset that clicked in on September 11th. And so I was able to escape with my guide dog, Roselle. Before I left, there was a colleague from our corporate office who was going to be part of our seminars, David Frank. And I got David to get our guests to the stairs and start them down. Then he came back and we swept the offices and we went to the stairs and we started down. Then we eventually made it all the way down to the bottom and got out. And it wasn't until after we were out and until both buildings fell that I was able to find out because I reached my wife on the phone and she told us how two aircraft had been crashed into the towers, two hijacked aircraft, one into the Pentagon and a fourth was still missing. when we were first attacked, I called my wife, but the media didn't know and nobody knew what was going on. But then I couldn't reach her again until after both towers fell, and she was the one who told us what had happened. So we got out, and then the next day, after getting home at about 7 in the evening on the 11th of September, I was on the next day I called Guide Dogs for the Blind, which is where I've gotten all of my guide dogs, and I called them because Karen, my wife, reminded me that several people from Guide Dogs for the Blind had visited us in the World Trade Center. So we wanted to let them know we were okay because they'd eventually remember it. And Joanne Ritter, the director of public information services for Guide Dogs, wrote a story that got published about me, and the media picked that up. And um, also because of that, I appeared on Larry King Live on CNN on the 14th of September. That was the first of 5 interviews with Larry King Live. And it became pretty obvious that we were pretty visible. Then people started calling me and asking me if I would allow them to hire me to come and talk about lessons we should learn from September 11th, talk about other things like leadership and teamwork and trust, and tell my story and all that. And it wasn't too long before Karen and I decided that that would be a whole lot more fun than managing a computer hardware sales team and selling hardware. So selling life and philosophy was a whole lot more fun. And also, in reality, if I could teach people how to deal with things like the World Trade Center, if I could teach them more about the fact that blindness isn't the problem, it's our misconceptions about blindness that's the problem, and teach them about guide dogs, it was worthwhile. So by the beginning of 2002, I became a full-time keynote speaker and still travel literally around the world talking about teamwork and trust, about leadership, about ethics. One of my favorite breakout talks is entitled Moving from Diversity to Inclusion. And it's entitled that because if you ask the typical diversity people what diversity is about, they'll tell you about race, gender, sexual orientation. But when you ask them about disabilities, oh, that's a social justice thing. It doesn't have anything to do with diversity. Balderdash. Disabilities in the
Absolutely.
in the traditional sense, disabilities is one of the very largest minorities in the world. In America, the Center for Disease Control says that 25% of all people have some sort of disability. Now, the disadvantage is that there isn't one kind of disability, there are a number. But anyway, so we call it moving from diversity to inclusion because since diversity's already not decided not to include disabilities, we won't let them do that with inclusion. You either have a disabilities as part of your inclusion discussions or you're not inclusive. It's all or
Mm.
nothing. So anyway, I am a full-time public speaker and have a lot of fun doing it. In 2011, I wrote Thunderdog, the story of a blind man, his guide dog, and the triumph of trust at ground zero. It became a #1 New York Times best-selling book. And Larry King actually wrote the foreword for it, which I was very blessed and pleased with. And then 2 years later, we wrote a children's book called Running with Roselle, which was really more about me growing up and Roselle, my guide dog in the World Trade Center growing up and how we met and so on. Wasn't really a World Trade Center book. But then earlier this year in August, we published a new book called Live Like a Guide Dog, True Stories from a Blind Man and His Dogs about being brave, overcoming adversity, and moving forward in faith. And the idea behind that was that when the pandemic began, travel stopped for me, like for most everyone. And so I had to find ways to earn an income, and I decided I would look into doing a podcast. So I started learning about doing a podcast and how I could use it as a revenue source. And also, I realized some people suggested that you ought to talk about fear. And I went, why? Well, because you weren't afraid coming out of the World Trade Center. And I realized that they weren't right. I was afraid, just like everyone else. But I realized then that a mindset had kicked in on September 11th, and I used fear to my advantage. I learned to control my fears, and that's what all the knowledge I got in the World Trade Center taught me. I learned to control fear and use it as a powerful tool rather than, as I would put it, blind me or overwhelm me or paralyze me or make it so I couldn't make decisions. I used fear to help me move forward. And so I decided to write a book about it and partnered with a woman named Carrie Wyatt Kent. And the two of us began writing the book. And as I said, it was published in August of this year. Along the way, I also discovered a company called Accessibe, Accessibe. And Accessibe is a company based in Israel and in New York. And what Accessibe does is it makes products that help make the internet more usable and accessible for a lot of different people with a lot of different kinds of disabilities. And when they were talking to me about joining the company, they asked what I was doing, and I said I was learning about podcasting. And the founder said, "Funny thing, we'd love it if somebody would do a podcast. Would you do as part of your responsibility a podcast for us?" And I said, "Sure, what do you want?" And he said, "I don't care. We just want a podcast so the world will know who we are." So in August of 2021, I started Unstoppable Mindset. Again, here we go, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. Same reason, inclusion, because that has to, by definition, include disabilities. Now, mostly people who come on don't talk about disabilities because that's not what they are about. But the idea behind the podcast is to really show listeners and viewers that, in fact, they're more unstoppable than they think they are. And I believe everyone has a story to tell. So we tell stories, we bring people on, ask them to tell their story, and we have conversations about their stories. So everyone who comes on knows what they want to talk about. They give me that information in advance, and we end up having a conversation. And literally tomorrow, as we are sitting here, we will publish episode 290 since the podcast began in August of 2021. We got very visible in LinkedIn in 2022. And the result was that because we were creating such a large backlog of people who had done podcast episodes, we had to go to 2 episodes a week. And even then, we're still having a good backlog, but it's fun. And it educates people, it teaches people. And out of that podcast came a couple things that I want to talk about since we're doing what we're doing today. Um, I've had a few people on who talk about diversity, as I mentioned, and we have discussions about disabilities and all that. But last March, that is March of 2023, I was in a hotel and I was there with my niece and nephew. It was 3 in the afternoon on a Saturday, and we were walking down the main staircase from the third floor to the first floor. And suddenly I heard a whole bunch of people starting to scream. And I asked my niece what's going on. And Tracy was very used to me. So, I mean, she was very comfortable around blind people and all that. And she said, the hotel just lost power and we lost power around the hotel. So people are screaming because they got to go find a smartphone. Even though there's lots of light coming in through all the windows and all that, people were still panicking because they didn't have the light that they were used to having. Well, Thomas Edison invented the electric light bulb in 1878, and he did that, if we use the Americans with Disabilities Act definition, as a reasonable accommodation for light-dependent people to be able to function in the dark. The reality is every single one of you who sees has your own disability. It is that you need light. You don't do well without light. Yeah, you probably could learn how to do it, but you won't, and you don't, and you haven't. So the reality is light dependence is a disability. So I've realized, and I've talked on my podcast over the past year about the fact that we need to change the definition of disability. Now, the diversity people say that disability is what it is, and I say, well, no, it's not, because disability doesn't mean a lack of ability. And they say, oh, yes, it does, because disability begins with dis. And I say, oh, yeah? Why is it then that disciple, discrete, and discern, for example, and disclose all begin with DIS? They're not negative. No, disability is not a lack of ability. Disability is a characteristic that every single person on this planet has, except it manifests itself differently for different people. Light dependent people don't do well without light. I don't care about light personally. I mean, I think that there's value in light, but I don't need to have it on to be able to function. But at the same time, it is part of our world. And so the fact is that everyone has a disability. It's just that it manifests itself differently for different people. And we've got to get to the point where we as a society, we as a race, recognize that just because someone is different than us and they don't have some of the same gifts that we do and the same things that we do, doesn't mean that they're less than us, because they probably have other gifts that we don't have. And the bottom line is we all have a disability, And we just need to recognize that no one's disability is worse or better than anyone else's. And so I've written articles about that, and I talk about that, and that's kind of um, one of the things that struck me as being very interesting in talking to you all about your podcast and on your podcast, because the fact is everyone has a disability, and we need to get beyond thinking that it only is limited to a few people who are less than the rest of us, because none of that's true.
Yeah.
That's my
And I
story.
think and I think it does ring true too, because I say so often, and especially to my kids, that, you know, when someone says act normal, well, define normal because
Hmm.
everyone's view of normal is completely different. And when you've
Well,
said that everyone has a disability, I was just like, oh my God, he's so right. You don't
well,
look at it like that.
After September 11th, people started saying we got to get back to normal. And it
It-
took me a while to realize why I reacted negatively to that. The reason is the answer is normal will never be the same again. Normal is different. And you're right. The fact is that normal for you isn't normal for me. That doesn't mean that we're both not
Absolutely.
normal.
Yeah. So when you said that about the light, it was just it was so true. And I've never looked at it like that. So thank you for opening my eyes as well, because, you know, I don't look at disability as a deficit to anyone. That is who they are, and that they bring so much to the world. And it's just about people embracing it and moving forward in a positive light. So yeah,
Right.
yeah, amazing. Amazing.
There's something I'd like to come back to, Michael, which you alluded to a couple of times, but right at the start, blindness was seen as a disability, and that meant that you had no hope. There was no hope for your future.
Well, that was other people's perceptions. There was no hope, remember?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's very well known that if you're lacking in one sense, your other senses are quite heightened.
Well, not necessarily.
Okay.
They are heightened if you train them. But just because I am blind, it doesn't necessarily mean that I hear better or anything else. But if I train my other senses, then I have those abilities, but it isn't an automatic process.
Okay.
And it's important to recognize that. It's a matter of training all the way across the board. Look, there are people who have excellent eyesight, like SEAL team members and others who have also trained their other senses, and they're very acute. But just because you lose or don't have one sense, it doesn't mean that the others are necessarily better unless you work at it.
Yeah, I like
And
that.
that's the important part.
Yeah. Yep. I feel like you've answered all the questions that I have, and I could go
No,
into.
but I would love to answer because I'm just inspired by it. Just, through your journey, through your life, you've had such an amazing support network, it feels, that you've had so many people that were willing to guide you and be there to support you. And it might be a hard question to answer, but who would be your greatest source of support and inspiration through your journey, through your
Oh,
life?
it has to be my parents and my
Yep.
wife, Karen.
Yep.
Um, Karen, for the last 40 years, my parents actually passed away in 1984 and 1987. My dad in 84 and my mom in 87. But certainly they were part of the network. But also Karen, because Karen and I really thought very much alike. We had a great marriage, as I love to tell people. She read, I pushed, worked out really well. But the fact is that we both had pretty much the same view about people, about disabilities, and so on. And so we very much supported each other in all sorts of different ways. Um, there were times that we had job problems. Even today, the unemployment rate among employable blind people is in the 50 to 60% range. Let's say it's 50%, but that's a whole lot different than like under 4% for most everyone
Mm.
else.
Yeah.
The fact is, it's all because people think we can't do stuff. It it isn't that we can't do it. It's just that what people think, and that's the problem. Um, and over time, technology is going to help that, but technology doesn't solve the basic problems. Another person who I think was a very great supporter of mine is a woman whose name was Jan Jenkins Jurgens. She got married while I knew her. She was Jan Jenkins, then she became Jan Jurgens. Jan was the director of the Office for Students with Disabilities at UC Irvine when I was there. Now, the problem with most of the offices today is that they do everything for students. Jan's philosophy was this. I needed to, for example, get textbooks in advance so that I could get them transcribed into Braille, especially physics and math books and so on. And Jan said, you know, if you have a problem with a professor, you've got to go to the professor and ask them. If you have a problem with a professor who won't give you the books, the information, because they want to wait until the last second to make a decision, you come and see me, and I will bring the power of the university to help you get that information. And he said, you know, another thing you might do is go meet the chancellor of the university. And I actually went and met Chancellor Dan, and I actually went to his office several times. We had great discussions, and I knew that he was a friend. He was curious about me and about various things, and we had good conversations. But if I couldn't get a professor to give me a book, I'd go to Jan. But Jan didn't do the work unless I came to her and said, a professor won't give me this information, so I need your help.
Okay.
And that's the important part, because she was very clear. If I needed to hire readers to read material, that's my job to hire the readers, not hers. And that's the way it should be, because the other side of that is it was my job to fire the readers if they didn't turn out to work well. And she was very clear that you have to learn to do all that stuff because you're going to have to do it when you get out of college. And so she was very much a supportive person by saying, my job, that is her job, is to be a supportive person, but not to do the work for you. So I was very blessed with Jan in college.
Okay, so what piece of advice, what key piece of advice would you give someone that feels like that their disability is holding them back?
Um, well, to be real blunt, and I don't want to sound mean, but get over it.
Yeah.
Your disability only holds you back if you let it. So here's another example. I am on the board of directors. In fact, I'm the vice president of the board of directors of the Colorado Center for the Blind, which is an orientation center that it's a residential facility that takes people newly blinded or people who are losing their eyesight from around the United States and some international people. They'll live at the center for 9 months, and they learn the techniques of blindness. They learn how to use technology. But the most important thing that the center teaches is a philosophy of blindness that says you can do what you want. In the summer, for example, well, in every class, let me rephrase that. Every day there is a class called philosophy where they just talk about blindness. The director of the center will come in sometime during the summer, and she'll say, okay, here are tickets to tonight's Colorado's Rockies game, the baseball team. Here's your tickets, here's your tickets, here's your tickets. Now, your job is to get there tonight. I'm not going to tell you how. We're not going to take you. You have to get there. If you're brand new, one of the students who is more experienced will work with you. You get the bus. You go to the stadium. You don't ask a usher to show you how to get to where to go. You can ask how to get there, but you have to get where you need to go so that you get to the right place, and then you can watch the game. So they have to do all of that. At the end of their 9-month period, the last thing they need to do, or what's probably the last thing they have to do, is prepare a meal, fully cook a meal for all the students and all of the staff. Prepare a lunch for everyone. So that's like for 50 people, they have to prepare a meal. They will, while they're learning how to travel with a cane, probably one of the last things they do is they get dropped off somewhere and they have to find their way back to the center. And as I understand it, you can only ask one question of people. You have to figure out how to do it. The point is, what they're learning is it's okay to be blind.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an anecdotal situation, but my understanding is that because of what people learn, The unemployment rate among people who go through that center is probably down closer to 30% or maybe even lower because they come out of the center with the confidence. They come out of the center understanding blindness isn't the problem, and we're not going to let it be a problem for us. We are going to move forward and we're going to demand our rightful place in the workforce. And then the center will help them find jobs, and they'll also guide you to other people who can help find jobs. But the bottom line is that they don't come out of that center believing that they are any less than anyone else in the world. And so that's why I kind of tell people, if they feel that their blindness or a disability really is holding them back, it's not the disability that's holding them back or you back. It's your attitude about disabilities and your attitude about yourself. So get over it. And I mean that in a very loving and positive way.
No, it's a beautiful message because I think, um, you're right. Just get up and face the world and do your best,
Well,
regardless.
and learn how to do it. So, and it doesn't mean you necessarily know right off how to do it,
Yeah.
but take the time to learn. Like we talked about heightening senses. You got to learn how to do that. You got to learn to develop your other senses. You have to learn to develop a positive attitude about being a person who most people think has a disability. Um, and nothing wrong with telling those other people, well, you have a disability too. You want me to prove it? So
Yeah.
there are a lot of things to do, but we need to understand we're not the problem.
Yeah.
When my wife was in college in a wheelchair, she went to the University of California at Riverside. Lots of buildings with stairs, no ramps, a lot of places without elevators. And she actually became a strong advocate at UC Riverside to change all of that. And she got involved during the year, International Year of the Disabled that the United Nations put out. And that began to create change in making the college a better place. And it became accessible. And she was a lot of the impetus behind that, she and other people. But she didn't regard herself as less than anyone else, which was the whole point.
Yeah. No, that's perfect way to look at it. Kate, do you have anything else for Michael?
Looking ahead, Michael, what are your hopes for the future, both
I
for
hope to
yourself and for society?
I hope that people will find speaking opportunities for me to come down and visit Australia. I'd love to come down and be hired to do some speaking. I've been to New Zealand, but I've not been to Australia, and I have an entry in my bucket list to meet a kangaroo. So I want to come to
Oh, love
Australia.
that. We'd love to have
So
you, Michael. Absolutely.
I'll put
so
it on my to-do
seriously,
list.
if corporations want a speaker to come and talk about leadership and teamwork, inspire people, um, I would love to help. I will send you guys some letters of reference that I've recently gotten from people who hired me to speak over the past year or so.
Oh, please
Um,
do.
but the bottom line is, so that's one thing I'd love to do. I want to continue to speak. I want to continue to inspire people. And I expect to be doing it for a while because I can't afford not to. So that's one thing. Um, I hope that society will recognize that our view of disabilities needs to change and that we shouldn't be looking down on someone just because they're different than we are. And that's a challenge because that's not where we are in society, whether it's here or anywhere else. Um, but I think that it is something that is very doable. So I think it is the kind of thing that we need to do. So I look forward to helping to inspire and help continue to help people understand that they can become and be productive members in society no matter what they do. So I'm hoping that I can continue to help people and make it possible for them to realize if they have a disability that in fact they're no less than anyone else. And if they encounter people with disabilities, there's never anything wrong with asking someone if they need help, but don't assume just because they're different than you that they need help. Accept the answer that you get, but don't make assumptions about what people are and what they're not, because that just doesn't help. Um, But the reality is that I think we all, as I said, we all have challenges, but we all have gifts. And I think it's important that we really work on making sure that all of us are able to um, move forward in society. And I look forward to the day when, in reality, what we can do is eliminate this thing called disability. Um, there is a person I know who once said that he looked forward to the day when um, we don't have to talk about accessibility anymore because everything is already inclusive. And I think that's a very valid thing.
Mm. And it's not actually, I mean, it is disability, but to me, it's almost different ability.
Well, but I don't think it's different. I think we all have abilities. We all have different gifts that get us there, but our abilities aren't different. I don't like even the term different ability or whatever because it isn't that. We have the same ability, we just get at it in different ways.
But do we have the same ability? Because if you're blind and I'm not, I suppose it's
All
not,
right.
you're right, it's not an ability.
That's my point. It's
Yes.
a method. So you read print, I read print. I use a scanner or my smartphone to use optical character recognition to read print. But that's no different than you because you use a light bulb. They're both technology.
Yeah.
Or you use a computer monitor. They're both technology. It isn't a different ability.
No,
It's a
you
different
are
way to get to
100%
the same
right.
thing.
Yeah, you're 100% right. It's not a different ability. It's a different, I can't think of the right word, but it's a different.
It's a different method to get to the same place.
Yes, yes. You can't see, I can. So we get there in two different ways.
Well, I don't see with my eyes, but I see a lot. Like I tell people, by the way, people always say I'm visually impaired. I am not visually impaired. And I think that's the most disgusting terminology that the professionals in the field of work with the blind ever created. First of all, visually, I'm not different because I'm blind. And second of all, I'm not impaired. And whenever we talk about visually impaired, all we're doing is continuing to promote that we are less than sighted people because we don't see. Blind and low vision is a much more appropriate term. People who are deaf will deck you if you say deaf or hearing impaired. They'll punch you in the nose until you're dead because they've learned that hearing impaired is a horrible term to say. Deaf or hard of hearing, but you don't equate and you don't create a comparison between how much one hears and doesn't hear.
How do we get
That's
this
a good way
out?
to look at it. Yeah,
How
it's
do we get this out into the community? Because if you don't have any experience with disability and so forth, you won't intentionally be.
Sure, it's all education, which is why I made the comment I'd love to come to Australia. I look for people who want me to come and speak to their organizations here in the United States, and I always work to try to educate people in everything that I do.
I love that center you spoke about where you go and do a 9-month program. I think that would be absolutely life-changing, and I'm not aware of anything that we have like that in Australia. Um, I also love you use the word inspire. You want to inspire people. My company name is actually Inspires and Co. And I chose that name because that is what I want to do, is to inspire people and let them know that there are choices out there and you can live the best life that you want to live. I
Well,
think a lot of it comes down to mindset, which is something else you've said, and learning. Like
mhm,
it's what you've been taught and how you learn as to where you end up.
exactly right. And and I don't mean this in a sarcastic way at all, but maybe through your company you can help find sponsors who will bring me down, and I'd be glad to talk to anybody about this. And it would be fun to come down and spend some time inspiring and educating and teaching people and showing them that in reality we're all part of the same spaceship Earth.
yeah.
Without a doubt. Let's take that offline and continue that conversation because that's something that, yeah, I would be very, very interested in. All right, we're almost at the end. What is
Well,
your
I
final piece of advice, Michael?
I want to read you something.
Okay.
This is something that was written by the founder of the National Federation of the Blind, Dr. Jacobus Tembrook. It was part of a speech that he gave at the 1956 National Federation of the Blind Convention in San Francisco. So it was his inspirational speech that he gave every year at the banquet. And this 1956, his speech was entitled "Within the Grace of God." And I want to read you the last two paragraphs because I think it summarizes everything we've talked about. Now, again, remember he's giving this talk to over 1,000 attendees at the convention. But what he wrote, the last two paragraphs go like this. In the 16th century, John Bradford made a famous remark, which has ever since been held up to us as a model of Christian humility and correct charity, and which you saw reflected in the agency quotations I presented. Seeing a beggar in his rags creeping along a wall through a flash of lightning in a stormy night, Bradford said, "But for the grace of God, there go I." Compassion was shown, pity was shown, charity was shown, humility was shown. There was even an acknowledgement that the relative positions of the two could and might have been switched. Yet, despite the compassion, despite the pity, despite the charity, despite the humility, how insufferably arrogant. There was still an unbridgeable gulf between Bradford and the beggar. They were not one, but two. Whatever might have been, Bradford thought himself Bradford and the beggar a beggar. One high, the other low. One wise, the other misguided. One strong, the other weak. One virtuous, the other depraved. We do not and cannot take the Bradford approach. It is not just that beggary is the badge of our past and is still all too often the present symbol of social attitudes toward us, although that is at least a part of it. But in the broader sense, we are that beggar and he is each of us. We are made in the same image and out of the same ingredients. We have the same weaknesses and strengths, the same feelings, emotions, and drives. And we are the product of the same social, economic, and other environmental forces. How much more consonant with the facts of individual social life, how much more a part of a true humanity to say instead, there, within the grace of God, do go I. And I can't summarize any better than that everything that we've talked about today.
So powerful and so true. It really is.
I think it's one of the most elegant
Yeah.
pieces and eloquent pieces I have ever encountered. And I just think that it's so important to really understand that we're all part of the same image. We're all part of the same thing.
If you've got a copy of that, Michael, I'd love to get a copy somehow of just those two paragraphs.
Well, well, you can get it, but I'll email it to you. So don't worry about it. I'll send you the whole speech because it's even more fun if you read the whole speech.
Wonderful.
We've loved sharing today's show with you, and we hope our intention to make a difference is reaching through the airwaves to you and your loved ones. Feel free to check out our show notes for the links you need to stay connected to Michael Hingson. Go to our Facebook page to engage with us at facebook.com/navigating disability, and wherever you're listening or watching this show, please give us a thumbs up, a heart, or 5-star rating. Share this show with as many people as you can, and let's make this world of disability a better place, one conversation at a time. Thank you so much, Michael, for your time, and it truly was inspiring, your entire life. The commitment, the confidence, the mindset really is amazing. We will work on getting you down to Australia as soon as possible.
And we'll have front row seats, Michael.
And we will have front row seats, absolutely.
I'd
Bye
love
for
to see
everyone
you.
now, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you
Thank you.
so
It was
much,
an honor to be here.
It's
It was
been
an
a
honor to
pleasure.
be here.
Thank you.